Hi, guys, and welcome back to the Backstage Bikini podcast with your hosts, Grace and Jade. And today we have a huge name really in the industry. I'm hyping you up here. He is the CEO and founder of the Physique Collective. He is a coach. He's an educator with one of the leading platforms in terms of actually educating people in this space now, which simply wasn't available when myself and Grace got involved in bodybuilding. So he needs little introduction, really. I've got Mr. Jeffery on the podcast. Hi, Joe.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. I better make this really good now.
No pressure.
You
Expectation is very high after hearing that.
We appreciate you coming on a lot. You're definitely someone who I respected in the industry for quite some time. And I think, especially when it comes to female education, you've been the first really in the UK to speak about it. So massive respect for what you do. And I'm so glad you've been able to kind of come on and chat to our listeners about everything. But before we get into it, do you want to let people know who you are specifically, how you kind of got into the industry, and I suppose going into bikini, how you kind of fell into that, and obviously touching on jazz, who everybody knows.
Yeah, so as Jade kindly said, potentially big me up a little bit further than what is truthful. My name is Joe Jeffery. I've been coaching quite a long time. I always lose touch of exactly how many years. I think it's edging on 9. I think next year will be a decade in the industry, which is pretty cool. Things have changed a hell of a lot in the time that I've been working in the industry. You mentioned jazz, so this was kind of my foray into the industry. So if anybody hasn't already realized by my second name, my wife is Jazz Jeffery, bikini competitor, owner of Compact. She runs the Not Just a Bikini Girl podcast. And when we met, she'd done one show, and I think it was the Fit Factor Body Power, something like this. And I wasn't even bodybuilding at the time. I was still doing martial arts, which is what I did for my whole life until I met Jazz. And I thought, I really like this girl, but we don't have anything in common. Like, I'd see her in the gym when I'd be going in and doing my boxing training. And we got chatting in the gym. I thought, right, let me get pretty good at this bodybuilding thing. And fell in love with it really quite quickly. Immediately into competitive bodybuilding. And I specifically caught up education as quickly as possible into the bikini class, because that's what Jazz has and does compete in. And as you mentioned, in terms of female specific education, I noticed off the bat there was quite a poor quality of, specifically when it comes to performance enhancing drugs. Don't know if this is something you're comfortable talking about on this podcast. Please let me know if I ever say anything.
Go ahead.
It's the Backstage Bikini podcast. We covered all.
Yeah. So when it came to drug use, we were like, just, and this was in a time when like evidence-based fitness was just kind of coming to the frontier. I was following guys like Lane Norton, who were logging on the bodybuilding.com forums back when he was straight flexed and he wasn't the famous Lane Norton that he is now. And people like Dr. Scott Stevenson on the Intense Muscle Forum. This was before social media, actually, or at least bodybuilding social media, definitely before Instagram, bodybuilding stuff. And that really resonated with me, the evidence-based approach to things, or at least the coupling of like being a meathead, but also wanting to know the intricacies of the science to generate a cause and effect kind of outcome. That's generally the way that my brain works with things. And yeah, when it came to females, there was very little. So I wanted to try and do that myself. And it's been pretty much my life's work since, not just on the female side, but on, I mean, I love bodybuilding as a whole. I've never loved anything like I love this thing. And every class and every federation I wanted to know everything about. And that's still true to this day. So I've been coaching and producing content and educational materials ever since.
Amazing. So interesting that you got into it through jazz, not the other way around. Is that correct?
Yeah.
It's
I was
mad,
into
it's
like
usually
lifting
the other way
weights.
around.
I was certainly like into lifting weight. I'm not going to say I wasn't into bodybuilding. I was into bodybuilding. But I was still doing martial arts as my primary kind of focus. I never saw myself as a bodybuilder. And I certainly wasn't like going to any shows or anything like this,
Mad.
That's insane.
Crazy.
Yeah. Were you coaching prior to that as well, Joe? Were you
No.
coaching in martial arts, or was that an entirely separate thing for?
No, this is a really odd one. So my job when I met Jazz, I was actually a session guitar player. You see one of my guitars over there. I've got all my guitars on the wall. So I was a professional guitar player full time when I met Jazz.
That's amazing.
And that had to change pretty quickly because I was always traveling. Like I met Jazz like the day I got back from a tour in Belgium, and then I'd be here there, and she was living in Manchester. We met in Northampton, and it was like I never got to see her, and I thought I can't like keep doing this and see my girlfriend like every 3 weeks or something. So I thought, what's one other thing that I really like doing? Thought, right, let me have a go at this. And it took years to get a full list of clients. It was so different back then. You didn't have business mentors or like Instagram ads, and I didn't know how to do anything. Like I remember getting Instagram, and I put like 2 pictures of my dog on there over like a whole year. And it was Jazz actually that said, like, you need to start like, because I was writing articles for myself, for my own learning, and I remember Jazz saying, like, you should put these out because they're really interesting. And as soon as I did, really, quite luckily, I pulled a bit of an audience because there wasn't many evidence-based educators in the PED space that were accessible. I mean, there's great minds that came before me, and I definitely stand on the shoulders of giants of people like Dr. Scott Stevenson. But his content's a lot more sort of high level for the most part. I think the accessibility of the way I presented things certainly helped me in the beginning.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to ask, because like anybody I've learned about that side of things, it's come from you, do you know? So I always want to know like where you sourced everything, and I suppose where your passion for actually learning about, you know, that side of things so heavily came from. Was it that in the UK that we were just a little bit kind of far behind, would you say, in that sense?
I'll be really honest and frank. It was purely personal. I couldn't live like not knowing everything about the thing that I was trying to be the best at, which is like, for better or for worse, something like I've always dealt with, like a complete inability to do anything I'm not interested in, which is how I ended up being a guitar player and not being anything of maybe finer educational status. But no, it was like, right, I want to know everything about this. And Jazz will tell you some funny stories where I'll like go down a research line. There's one story I always tell where I was like reading about growth hormone, and I'd like assume that it was really anabolic in and of itself and must drive like muscle protein synthesis or something. And I remember someone called Chester Rockwell, which is an anonymous name from an old bodybuilding forum. Again, no one's going to know who that is, but he was one of the first evidence-based PED educators I found, and he posted this paper where we were like differentiating between lean body mass and skeletal body mass, and there was no evidence that growth hormone actually in and of itself could create skeletal muscle hypertrophy. And it drove me so mad that I stayed up all night, not slept once, going down this like PubMed rabbit hole. And then we had to drive my sister to the zoo the next morning, and I had to have a nap in the picnic area. But you know,
all paid off.
the obsession was there purely because I need to know everything, ideally. You know.
Yeah.
And that might be quite a selfish sort of angle for you, Joe. But the reality of it is that you've shared that information out into a space that otherwise didn't have it. Is that the motivation now, whilst it started to be quite an internal thing that you need to know? Is that still very much there, or is that sharing of information equally as important for you now?
Yeah, although, like, you know, I wouldn't have gone so far down the line of trying to learn about female PEDs if it was just entirely personal. It's more so like an obsession with knowing as much as possible and coming to like the best answer that we can currently generate in that moment, and then pair it together with anecdotes of clients and things like that. And, you know, to create this almost like algorithm that comes out to be quote unquote optimal is like my obsession. And you need other people to be able to be a part of that, you know?
Yeah.
And you said you've been in the industry, I suppose, 10 years. Like that's pretty hefty, especially when it comes to bikini and how much it's evolved in this time frame. And even Jazz, she got into it quite early as well. I'm sure you were kind of coaching athletes back then, but have you noticed, I suppose, with just your time coaching and more you've learned, and have you kind of changed your approach when it comes to coaching bikini athletes with the evolving criteria, and I suppose the more you've come to learn as well as a coach?
Oh yeah, I changed my mind on things whenever I'm presented with evidence that shows me what I'm currently doing is not the most efficient or optimal route. Me and Holly were talking about that at the weekend, because I think this is a trait of a good coach. Because I remember at one period, but I'm not going to name who it is, by another like big coach, I got a bit of a blast in on Instagram because I changed my mind on something that I had quite like a firmly held belief on, and was criticized for sort of 180 and on. I think it was training intensity. I'm sure it was something to do with like proximity to failure in training. But I think we need to be careful of having like emotional attachments to beliefs, and always being open when presented with new evidence to change your mind on something. And I've changed my mind on so many things over the years that it's untrue. And I will again if I learn that there's a better way.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's why we got you on as well, because I think we've had a lot of, coaches on this with a very, very similar approach to things. Not entirely the same, but I think you're very, very different with that, and that you're willing to try new methods as well. And it's not just a case of, okay, you're a bikini athlete, you have less muscle, so you do X and that's it, and there's nothing changed. Like, I think it's important that you're able to adapt, and especially what you did with Jazz this year, adapt from prep to prep has been really, really interesting.
Yeah, it's been cool to showcase things with Jazz, because obviously I live with her, so I've got the tightest hold on her coaching ever. So we can really gather intricate data and experiment and refine. And I've peaked her for shows over years now, and we've changed the formula many times, and things that have worked in the past haven't worked again, and we've needed to sort of turn the dials differently between shows and seasons, depending on the specific look and the amount of muscle that she's added over that time and where that muscle is. And it's been fascinating to see over so many years in person, something like that. And I've learned a hell of a lot from Jazz. In fact, like, without Jazz, I wouldn't be like 10% the bikini coach I am now, because like, without even realizing it, I've gathered so much data about coaching. Because for Compact, Jazz watches every show. She buys the live stream, and we'll sit and watch it, and she'll write down the shoes and the jewelry, and and I start to pick up on things all these years ago, like the specificity of hair, makeup, glaze, tan, shoes. And I started to notice that a lot of male coaches especially don't know those things. And one thing I love about bikini is it's the most intricate and the most nuanced class that there is, which fascinates me, and ever changing, ever evolving, and ever dependent show to show on who's in the lineup, what the judges want to even see that season, and then maybe what the judges are saying they don't want to see next season or later season. So you have to keep your finger on the pulse in bikini. It doesn't change much in bodybuilding,
Yeah,
no,
very, very
and
true.
I think people have been guilty in the past, and like, I'd never name names or anything like that. I think it was a generalization way back when, probably when you started first coaching, Joe, like that there was a generalization that bikini was just a smaller bodybuilder. It was a smaller female bodybuilder with less muscle, so you could push them that little bit more, or the dieting protocols, or the condition was the nuances, as you've spoken about, that we love so much about the criteria, just simply weren't understood back then. And I think there's a push towards understanding it now, but I still think we're lagging compared to the US in parts. But what is it about sort of picking on the bikini criteria? And Jazz is a perfect example, because she's done so many federations over so many years. But talking specifically about the criteria and how that's evolved, what is it that you found that you've had to adapt, or can you pinpoint the things, or is there too many that you've had to adapt about your coaching and the way you approach things with an athlete? What is it that's changed over the years and with that evolving criteria?
So I think we could have a extremely verbose conversation about that. I think if I could bring it down to like one word. In fact, I want to give you a quote based on something that you said in the last point you made. I just want to put a quote out there from Lyle McDonald that I always remember, which is, "Women aren't small men." And that's often the way that we would coach them. And I've seen people use that quote quite often. Is from the Woman's Book by Lyle McDonald, which if any females or coaches are listening, that's a must read. Lyle is a great mind. Anyway, sorry, to your question. I think if I could reel that back to one word, it would be specificity. And there's so much specificity within coaching a bikini client. The individual's specificity, their individual response to various nutrition, training, drug, supplementation, even down to sleep, stress management inputs. You've got specificity there to be aware of. Definitely within training, specialization and prioritization around the specific criteria and federation they are aiming for as their preference, which is important, because bikini competitors like to do many shows across many federations like jazz. If criteria differ greatly, like if you're going to do a PCA show the week after a WBFF show, that's going to be a squeeze on the condition, right? So you have to be very specific with what dials you turn to move your way through your show season. And then there's the specificity of look and standards based on the criteria. Again, we mentioned PCA, like the condition. It's almost like you could just about turn up with striated glutes and like be voted up. IFBB, you know, clear glute ham separation is
preferred.
I was going to say required. Don't know if I say required. Preferential, but if you have striation, if you have hamstring striation or quad vascularity or something like that, then you're going to get marked down. So there's the specificity, and there's even further specificity. So it's like if you get super hard from the front, your quads are too detailed, but then you're still too soft from the back. We're going to have to be very specific about how we turn dials specifically for repeat week to make sure that that doesn't influence the judge's opinion of your condition on the day. So it's like this giant specificity bubble of hundreds of different things that you need to be aware of, which I think any good coaching is just high level problem solving, being able to look at this really wide landscape and assess exactly what you need as a broad spectrum piece of programming, and learning over time what dials to turn. Just like with Jazz, she got better and better and better every season, added muscle where she needed to, improve condition how she needed to. Like her favorite look that she had this year for me was Portugal, even though it was her worst placing. I thought that was the best, closest to IFBB criteria she ever got. And we've never been able to achieve that kind of balance and separation through the rear and the front before. That's something that we've learned.
It's interesting with the international shows. I feel like there's a massive like stress response when you go over there. I don't know if you agree, Joe, like just being in that environment. Seems a lot of people bring a really, really good look when they travel abroad, I think just because of the environment that they're in. But it's interesting to say that. But in terms of like all the different federations, I think as a coach, you learn so much adapting to that you're not just tied down to NPC and you're working towards one look. Like it's requiring you to use a lot of tools in your toolbox. Would you say that aspect of things, that coaching a bikini athlete is almost more difficult doing all those different shows, and even though like the back-to-back peak weeks, would you say as a female, coaching a female, it's a little bit harder to manage those scenarios?
There are things that are harder about it and easier about it than a male season. This would also depend, like I don't coach any natural clients anymore. If I had a client that had no endogenous hormone function because they'd been lean for this long, I think that would be ethically, I'd really struggle with that. That would be a difficult scenario to deal with, and the look would fade much faster. Not to say your look won't fade if you're enhanced, it certainly will. And you've only got so much leeway of duration of time that you can be on androgens as an enhanced individual, assuming this individual's using androgens. So there are great difficulties with it. There's also great difficulties with male bodybuilders on the pro qualifier circuit, for example. That's one of the hardest things psychologically more than anything for them to manage. I find that coaching females is much easier on the psychology side, to be honest, which I think most
really
interesting.
I'm like shook.
We thought we were a handful.
I'll be honest, the stereotype of male bodybuilder, panic, what's the word I'm looking for here? I mean, anybody that gets into trying to be hypermuscular has a bit of a personality issue, right? And these kind of things worsen and worsen and worsen as they get through prep. A lot of it's going to be driven by the kind of condition that they need to get in and then stay in and even improve on. Females, honestly, I've had a very easy ride with prepping females. They complain a lot less. They execute a lot more efficiently, it seems. They understand that there's some things that they're just going to have to do regardless.
Yeah, that's true. And I think for with Jazz as well, you have she's very, very good at handling things. When we had her on the podcast, like we were so we admired her so much for her approach, I suppose, to her seasons, and I think something that we can all kind of take with us. But maybe somebody like me, it's not as easy to deal with.
Jazz is funny because it's like I just feel like her prep starts and then we're at the show, and it's like, how did that happen? It's like I haven't even heard anything like from her.
Yeah,
like I just forget she's on prep. It's just normal, I just notice she's getting really lean.
yeah. I suppose if you were to take an athlete who was similar to, a bodybuilder who was going for that kind of the pro card, would I suppose managing the stress, would you find it a little bit harder then in terms of the look and even like peaking the individual, or just them being on prep for a longer period of time? Would you find it more difficult to manage?
I think it's
bringing in a fresh look all the time.
It's easier to manage a bikini client, especially IFBB, because you said pro qualifier hunt, because they're not getting down to body fats that's going to crumble them as quickly as a male bodybuilder. And if you space your shows properly in a way that I would advise, then you should have enough time to kind of resensitize, for lack of a better word, between shows. And again, on the assumption that you don't use exogenous hormones, because this is like a big issue that I've come up with, not with my own clients, but with consult clients in the past, which is like they've started using androgens from maybe 4 weeks out of their pro qualifier, and then they haven't got it, and then the next one's in 2 weeks, and they think, oh, so close, I'll go again, and then they've been on for 6 weeks, and then they don't get it, and it's like, oh well, next week there's one in Sweden, so let's just go and try. And before you know it, they've been on for like 16 weeks.
Yeah.
Ouch. It's worrying. I mean, from a peaking standpoint, I know we've touched on it there with Grace, but like from a peaking standpoint for a bikini athlete, I know you've spoken on other podcasts about backloading and other approaches, the fact that you don't like to backload. Is there a specific approach that you would take generally? I know every individual is different, but is there a way that you prefer to peak a bikini athlete, having the look in mind, depending on the individual? What's your approach generally? I know it's a difficult generalization.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's too hard, because and I'll come on to this shortly. I think I'll qualify a statement you mentioned there if I don't like backloading. I'll say specifically with bikini clients, I'm not a fan of backloading.
Yeah.
So you are correct, but just in case like a classic bodybuilder's listening to that, trying to cram to there's like 2,000 gram of carb the 2 days before the weigh-in or something. So I think that peak week is one of these things, and I don't know how it ended up like this, it's become like a mystical thing that there's like, I don't know if it's about like peak week secrets or strategies for peaks that have like, the secret source of this or a way you should do it. I've taught coaches to peak loads of times over my career, and I've spent a lot of my early career peaking other coaches' clients. That's how I got most of my first clients. And the way that I prefer to look at this is it's quite simple if we break it down into parts. So you've got pre-peak, there needs to be a period of washing off fatigue, because you need to be in a position where you're not carrying any cortisol-mediated extracellular fluid, any training-mediated fatigue that's going to blur condition on stage, but you can kind of taper that through the peak week itself. You have to have returned to maintenance calories, ideally for 5 to 7 days prior to the peak, to have an accurate view of energy balance more than anything. And then we've got two processes that I always describe as like dials that you can turn, and you base these on the individual. There's going to have to be some amount of intramuscular loading included. We've got propensity for intramuscular glycogen for the most part. So carbohydrate intake is going to be the largest caloric intake over that time. Females, in my experience, and let me be clear, I'm basing this on conjecture and anecdote, I've got no research to support this, intramuscular triglycerides seem to have a more pronounced effect. In fact, if anybody wants to see that, I did a post on Jazz where we did like this 2-day comparison of fat loading remember what show it was for. I think it was for PCA. I think that might have been when she got the overall at PCA, where we did like 2 days of fat loading, and it has like a really pronounced effect on her intramuscular volume. Her more than anybody I've noticed, like a really robust shift of fat loading. But anyway, so there has to be some period of loading intramuscularly if you want to present a certain amount of volumization to your musculature on stage. But then here, this is a dial that we turn, right? How much of that do you need? If you're ultra muscular, you're going to be the odd one out in the lineup if you get really full. Just don't turn the dial, or only turn it subtly.
Mm-hmm.
So you can choose where that lands. And this is something that we experimented with Jazz. And I was using like a grams per kilogram of fat and a grams per kilogram of carbohydrate per show, that we would I would take a best guess based on her prior peaks, and we would try that and then tweak for the next show, and then tweak. And we kind of come to this really perfect amount for Portugal, in my opinion, which again was their worst place, that worked for her. And that's a formula that will work every time at the level of musculature that she has now. So it's going to completely change next year. But anyway, so we've got this fatigue wash off, we've got this intramuscular filling period, and then we've got a period of diuresis if necessary. So what we're talking about there is essentially increasing fluid and sodium excretion to present a drier look. So that interstitial extracellular fluid that is sat between the skin and the muscle itself. And again, it's a dial that you can turn to any which way that you want. And we have to be specific in the bikini criteria, right? PCA, yeah, I mean, ramp the shit out of that one, get really dry. If anybody wants to see what the best PCA bikini look ever is, look at Tony House Masters Bikini. I think it was 2 weeks ago. Man, that was I was at the show. What a look. That look was unreal. As soon as she walked out, I knew that overall was hers. That was like PCA bikini
on the money.
To the T.
Let's look it up.
Once the inspiration. She was coached by Ryan Kirkham, who's never coached anybody before in his life, which was insane. I just gave him a few tips, and she's just such a gifted athlete.
Anyway. When you get the talent and you just get the peak right as well in the right show,
goosebumps. Yeah, insane. Pictures don't do it justice.
Oh, she's great. I think she's doing the Masters Pro qualifier in Italy later this year. Yeah, if she doesn't get a pro,
so she's over 35 then. That's impressive.
Yeah. They both are, and they're both incredible competitors, Ryan and Tony. Anyway, sorry. So you can choose how hard to crank this diuresis input as much as you like. IFBB, you can, and it's visuals, right? You could kind of look at yourself and judge that against the criteria or where the judging is going and what physique you think you want to match yours up to. And, I could be a little bit drier than I am now. And then you can decide how to crank that dial. It could be anything from just restricting water a little bit to cutting sodium and water loading and pulling water, or using some kind of over-the-counter diuretic supplements like a Strom Peak Max. Or if you're going the drug route, it could be like aldosterone antagonists or diuretics or some, it's not me recommending this, but you as the individual can choose how to move these dials how you like. But that's what's a little bit more difficult about bikini, because bodybuilder, I load you until you're full, and then you can spill, and then I need to dry you off until there's nothing left.
Yeah.
And it's not a simple process.
Yeah.
It's a lot easier than when we're loading Jazz. We're literally looking meal by meal on the loading, and then we're getting to the end of the day and she's like, "No, I look shit, I've eaten too much, But then, the next day when you get to the drying off and you start to elucidate what's under that. So it's like being able to see what's in the moment now and also projecting what's to come is very difficult. And the way that I would prefer to structure this in a bikini athlete, sorry, just quickly, GI volume is a big one with bikini girls. So having a kind of wash off day, at least one day between the period that you load and the time that you get on stage. If you're on stage on a Saturday, like that Friday, I would not be loading. I would do maintenance calories, either just with protein and fat, which is Jazz's preference, which is most people's preference, or a mixed macronutrient layout with just with maintenance calories. Get your loading done before that, two days or 1.5 days, whatever, before that, and have that buffer in there. Same goes for show day. Like most of the time, bikini girls, I'll feed them very little on show day. I mean, you girls know you're on late a lot of the time, so there is gonna have to be some kind of food consumed, but it has to be extremely low volume. There are calculators where you can get the food weight in grams as compared to the caloric and macronutrient content that's quite useful to use. So if you want to get like X amount of carbohydrate in the smallest food weight as possible, you can have a look on these calculators and do that.
Yeah.
It's
interesting, I suppose, how much is juggled in peak week anyway, but I think specifically how the approach that you like to take, because as I said at the beginning, like a lot of coaches kind of just go in and say, right, same amount of water, you know, not giving you too much carbs, maybe a little bit above baseline. But I think the approach that you take, there's a lot going on and a lot of things to manage. And do you ever find with all that you need to juggle that it ever kind of, I suppose, turns out how you don't want it to, especially when it comes to the diuresis element of it? Have you ever kind of gone maybe too far with that maybe the look has flattened off too much, the point of like it's unfixable no matter how much you try and load up maybe on the day? Or do you kind of always nail it?
I think the only time you're going to have issues with aggressive diuresis, where there's going to be issues with like sodium reabsorption and therefore being able to partition glucose, is going to be in the pharmaceutical diuretic realm. And with a bikini athlete, I've never used I was gonna say I've never used a diuretic, but I'm gonna correct myself. I've used aldactone with bikini athletes before. Not necessarily a classical diuretic. This is an aldosterone antagonist, very long acting. Something like that you're gonna see happening a mile off. I don't like any high magnitude, short duration of action diuretic protocols for anybody, to be honest. I can't remember the last time I've used anything like that. So like Diazide or Lasix or something like that. I can't remember the last time I used something like that. So generally, if you're paying attention, and I think this is more of a word to coaches, because you mentioned like juggling a lot of things and managing a lot of things. The only time things like that are going to go wrong if the coach isn't paying attention. And a symptom of online coaching now is oversubscription of clients, and not doing the job properly. So I've always like vehemently capped my clients, and I brought that cap down over the years. Like my cap's 40, and admittedly I've got 44 at the minute, which doesn't sound like a lot of clients, but every single one of them is a competitor, and every single one of them is doing like at least 5 shows in the season. And often I'm peaking 4 guys, you know, who are checking in every single morning at 5 a.m. and we're nailing them, and then I've got check-ins to do for the rest of the day. How would I do that if I had 100 clients, which a lot of coaches do, or 150? You know, when I see people saying they're doing 20 check-ins a day, I think, what? It's impossible. It's impossible to do 20 check-ins in a day properly. If you're Gem Pop or whatever, and you're just throwing someone some macros, yeah, of course you can do 100 of them. But if you're coaching competitors, like, be honest, and you want to nail this like high level of specificity and get the best result for your client, it comes back to this thing where I'm like absolutely obsessed with optimality, and I can't live not knowing that I haven't I got the best result out of a client. Like, it would kill me. So I think it's going to come down to that experience, one, and actually paying attention. Because if something like that's going to happen, you're going to see it coming. Like, you're not going to aggressively spill a client if they're sending you photos after every meal, unless you're blind. You're not going to like push an individual to such aggressive diuresis without the pharmaceutical diuretic use, and just, again, not looking at them or not tracking their rate of urination or something like that.
Yeah, I say a lot of things to juggle, but if you've got a lot of clients to juggle, it's going to make that you can process a hell of a lot harder anyways. But I suppose touching on that, would you be a fan then when it comes to a bikini athlete, when it comes to a natural diuretic, would the strong peak max, is that something you gear to more towards, or is it kind of just like the traditional dandelion route?
Here's a fun fact for you. Jazz was the first person on planet Earth to ever use strong peak max.
Really?
Yeah,
I feel like Jazz is like a test tube bikini athlete.
So me and Rick, who owns Strom, is a great friend of mine. I love Rick to death, and I cannot recommend the Strom products enough. They are incredible. Everything efficaciously dosed with exactly what you'd want in there, and nothing that you don't want in there. And I'm not sponsored by Strom. This is just dead honesty. So back in the I was going to say early days of my coaching, it's probably only like 4 or 5 years ago, I always used to use this like diuresis stack with clients that I kind of partially robbed off of Dr. Scott. which would have like vitamin C and B6 and dandelion root and things like this in it. And all my clients would have to buy these things separately off Amazon. And I didn't really like that because they're already stressed in a peak week. And, got to sort like these 5 different supplements. Like every 3 hours, I've got to take like this much of this and this much of this, whatever. And then I remember Rick sending me a voice note one day, like, because I was working with Christian at the time. And I think he'd seen what Christian was doing for one of his peaks or something. And he said, I've got this product that's like similar to what you do. Do you want to try it out? And it makes things a hell of a lot easier. And I use that on literally every single client that gets on stage, without exception.
That's brilliant.
The day before,
I saw a few white wine things, and alcohol was going around for a couple of years, wasn't it? Or have I made that up?
It still happens.
Does it?
Yeah.
Vodka shot before stage. Couldn't think of anything worse.
Yeah. I wouldn't recommend it. I mean, if it chills you out, like drops cortisol a little bit, like cool. But it's certainly not a diuretic. Like it won't even encourage diuresis to the amount of fluid that you have to consume the alcohol in. So it's not working for diuresis, but maybe it's chilling you out. Maybe.
Yeah.
But yeah.
On that one, like, is there anything in terms of like peak week and manipulating that look in the kind of coming days? Is there anything for bikini athlete? I know you touched on like a diet, but is there anything else like compound wise that you would absolutely kind of stay away from, specifically for bikini, that like might be a red flag for any of the listeners?
Drug wise?
Yeah.
I find it really hard to say like definitely don't do this, because there's like a great deal of inter-individual context that I think needs to apply. Like, I'd never want to rule out like anything and do this kind of fear-mongering or virtue signaling, like I never use these drugs on my clients. Like
yeah.
In this industry, I mean, my general recommendations for women are you will, unless you're in figure or physique or something like that, which I also coach and love. In fact, tomorrow morning, one of my figure athletes and one of my physique athletes are coming down to train the doghouse. If you guys want to see something crazy, my client Beefy, her name isn't Beefy, but what's her Instagram name?
I know her. I do know her. Actually,
yeah, so she's never competed before. And I coach powerlifting. I used to just do her nutrition and whatever else. And she said, yeah, I want to compete this year. And she's peeled now. It's absolutely nuts. Anyway, I went way adrift there. It's unlikely that nobody needs pharmaceutical diuretics, right? Nobody needs it. Is there going to be an emergency that under great due diligence and whatnot that you couldn't use it and have a great result? Maybe, but that's going to be the 1% of the 1%. Drugs to avoid on peak week. I don't like growth hormone or Yohim being used within close proximity to a show just for the propensity of extracellular fluid retention. Most individuals are going to look better without those. Here's one.
It's interesting to say that, sorry, on the growth hormone, because do you ever feel that it might be contributing to the fullness that you might want to actually achieve for that?
Yeah, so that's why I say that this kind of majority of individuals, in my experience, I've found the inhibition of condition that might come with the aldosterone increase of growth hormone use isn't worth the quote unquote fullness driven by nitrogen retention and increases by glycogen synthase and growth hormone when compared to what you could just do with glycogen.
Okay. Yeah. And I suppose just from a predictability standpoint, that's what I'd be kind of looking at.
Yeah, I'll normally drop growth hormone out like 3 weeks out personally. And I've also got my clients ready at about 3 weeks out anyway. So we have this almost fatigue wash off stabilization period, because there's a lot of things that can blur the look. Everyone's done this thing where they get to like a deload or a refeed and they drop weight. And it's not because there's some kind of magic of like the 5 guys that you ate like put you into some kind of metabolic furnace or some other bollocks. Like it's this cortisol mediated fluid shift, right? And we need that period of time to see what the physique actually looks like. So as little moving parts as possible. What I don't like in women personally, and I don't think you ever need to do, is any selective estrogen receptor modulators or aromatase inhibitors, which is still
that's what I was I suppose that's what I was pointing at, because I've definitely heard it in the grapevine.
It still happens. It happens very frequently on the pro circuit. Like tamoxifen use more than anything is very, very common. So what we're essentially doing there, if you look at the androgen-estrogen ratio, has an effect on the cosmetic outcome of the physique. So an androgen-dominant androgen-estrogen ratio is going to modulate a greater retention of intramuscular volume and less extracellular volume, and vice versa. So moving estrogen down and or moving androgen up is going to mean more intramuscular retention, which is why when somebody would take Anavar and they're like, oh, this has dried me out, when it hasn't shifted fluid off of you, it's partitioned more fluid intramuscularly. All right. So and this would be the reason for this, but I would much rather adjust stack design with an individual, and these individuals are going to be using androgens for the most part, so if they were using like a HRT testosterone, maybe I would remove that, and they're already using like a primobolan or something like that, which is going to be plenty of androgen in the blood as compared to blood estrogen. And I mean, again, coming back to the bikini class, like, what are we really trying to do here? Like, do you need that much like dryness that you need to take drugs that are incredibly like, when it comes to AIs and SERMs, I'm very uncomfortable with bodybuilders. Absolutely, there's going to be acute use of these things in a peak week for sure. Like, you can't get away from that, and yes, it's incredibly damaging to your health being like a super heavyweight bodybuilder. I think everybody knows that. When it comes to bikini, and we're not talking about like hypermuscular individuals with these crazy conditioning goals, just don't go down that road.
No. And I think we've spoken about it so many times. I think time is an unspoken, well, not unspoken on this podcast anyway, but time is something that I think people really need to sort of accept in this, because even with a lower sort of a division with lower muscularity demands and things like that, like it's very easy to run to androgen use or PED use and things like that, and introduce that much earlier than is respectfully needed per person, or depending on your exposure to the sport and training. But I think adapting or giving yourself some time to actually bed into this sport and see what is needed, instead of rushing in and taking all of these PEDs or whatever else that is thrown at you just for the purpose of getting to the end goal so much quicker. Do you find that, Joe? Do you get people like that anymore? Do you get people who are willing to throw anything but a cat at this situation and be like, I will take anything, it doesn't matter?
Yeah, I think I've come to realize that there's nothing me, you, or anybody can do to stop an individual that's gonna do that from doing it anyway. I've tried for years. This is what I had such a heavy press to create like a female model of drug use that was non-androgenic for so long, and I've literally spent so much money getting Jake to film me talking about this stuff like over and over again. And it's not like I'm trying to get clients, because I've been full for years. Like, it's not like for any personal gain. Where it gets picked up is novices, which is great, which people coming into the industry, and rather than being told, Anavar will help you get shredded or whatever, and just taking Anavar was super normal back when I started. Now novices have great access to information. There's also a plethora of information, a lot of it bad, which is one negative. If someone's new to bodybuilding and they sign up to Physique Collective, they're going to get great information, and they want to start taking drugs, and no one's going to stop them taking drugs. They're not going to start with Anavar. They're going to start with metformin, telmisartan, growth hormones, something like this, clenbuterol, yohimbine, etc. And there's so many non-androgenic inputs on a body that is so anabolically and lipolytically sensitive that they're going to get fantastic outcomes, right? But it still goes to this day, but can't I just take, I'm just going to take Anavar, it's just easy. And I just take the pill. Well, I just want to inject stuff. Or there's still coaches saying things like, no bikini girl should ever use insulin. But doing Anavar for 12 weeks is cool.
Yeah. It's a common thing in Australia. I've seen loads of coaches going on about it. It's a different world over there when it comes to education.
Australia's definitely behind. I see a lot of Australia, because one of my best friends in the world, Dean McKillop, I'm going to say is the best coach in Australia, hands down. And one of my mentee clients, George Wilson, who ended up getting hired by Dean McKillop, who now works for Flex, he has a full book of competitors that are all Australian. And it's bizarre how far back the practices are there.
Yeah, really, really it is. I think that's why we want to get you on, because we do have a few listeners from there. But the education in some parts, it's just not there, especially when it comes to bikini. It's like coaches don't want to talk about it because they're too naive, you know. And I think even when it comes to peaking, maybe that's why a lot of them don't take the approach that you might take, is because they're just too nervous to do it. They don't really know what they're doing, so they'd rather just play it safe, or like you said, throw the kind of anabar at them or whatever. But no, it's interesting. And there was one thing you touched on when it came to the HRT side of things in a prep scenario. Do you always tend to pull it out if there's kind of like, you know, other androgens going in the forms of primo, or is there any scenario where you might kind of keep it in? And how would you approach that kind of after post prep?
Honestly, for bikini clients, that's not something that I've ever had to do. For figure and physique clients, we pretty much do as much as we can, because that's a whole different ball game. Like, we're pulling every lever we can to get as dry as possible in those individuals, and without using an AI or a SERM, even though it's a fairly small magnitude of effect, the 1% makes a difference. But if you do remove your testosterone, I would just immediately reintroduce it at your HRT dosages post-show. You know, these things do have like a relatively long active life. However, they do reach peak concentration max in the blood, like a testosterone enanthate, within, you know, on average 24 hours. So you're still going to be back to somewhat sufficient aromatase action from testosterone. But, you know, talking about testosterone in women is super important in a prep, because if you choose to use something like anabar or primo or mastron or MPP, whatever, there will be HPO axis shutdown, which means endogenous testosterone and estrogen and progesterone, LH, FSH, will be in the toilet, and that's terrible for your long-term health. Opens up multiple disease risks. And, you know, well, we can say, it's only like 8 weeks, whatever. It's like, yeah, but, you know, you might actually be on prep for like 16 this year, and then 16 next year, and then 16, that's like 4 months. And over the next 3 years, a third of your life is going to be spent in like hormonal ablation territory. And we're going to see the consequences of that, I guarantee, in years to come. And if you're a natural competitor, I don't even know what to say to you. It's terrible for you.
We've actually we touched on it a lot with, we had Corey on, I think we spoke Corey Fit on Hageman, sorry. We talked a good bit about that, but I think it's good to get your perspective on it. Do you like have many athletes maybe coming to you for consults, or even coaches coming to you for consults in that scenario where they finish a prep, they've looked at their blood work, and they're like, oh fuck, Joe save me,
help?
I've done tons of those. And I don't know if you remember, ages ago, Jazz went through one of these scenarios where post-show her hormone panel, because, you know, she was natural for a long time, was like in the toilet. And I think it was close to 2 years of doing everything. Like, it was at least 1.5 years of doing like everything in her power, like collateral fattening, like really uncomfortable drive to get hormonal function back. And like, even then it was okay. I will say that's not the norm. Most people will recover endogenous physiological function, I want to say, relatively quickly. It's going to depend. Just don't reverse diet, whatever you do. Females, like natural females, like reverse dieting is a lie sold to you by Lane McDonald about metabolic damage or whatever.
Regulation,
just immediate surplus post show. If you want to have any chance of driving progression and or physiological and psychological recovery, there will have to be a large amount of body fat gain off the bat if you want to get that recovery done as quickly as possible, likely right up to the point that you started the prep as quickly as possible, unless you were above the sort of quote unquote healthy ranges of body fat. But there's a big cost to pay as a natural competitor hormonally. Even if you're competing in open federations like PCA, Tubros, whatever, and you don't use PEDs, that's great. And if you can compete that way, keep doing that, because that's undoubtedly better for your health. However, be aware that hormone replacement therapy should be a consideration, whether it be testosterone, whether it be testosterone coupled with estradiol and or progesterone, whether you have partial or full HBO axis shutdown, whether it be thyroid replacement therapy, you know, whether down the line growth hormone replacement therapy, whether you use a basal insulin and the high caloric loads in the off season. These kind of prophylactic practices are important to consider.
Definitely overlooked. And I think if a lot of coaches knew more about it, people might run into less issues, especially post-show. But I suppose touching on the HRT element of things, is there ever a scenario, what I'm always curious about, where you do push things, you know, above physiological levels, you know, with androgens in a prep scenario, and even potentially maybe thyroid? Does that ever change then when you kind of go back to just, you know, your off season outside of a prep? Does that ever change the replacement
the dosing that I would use in a prep?
Yeah. Does I suppose if you've kind of pushed that limit, do you ever find that might change then, you know, post prep, that the replacement dosage is actually higher than it was previously? For example, HRT maybe being a 3 and maybe have to push it up to 5 if you push the androgens too high. I'm making sense of that.
I've never noticed anything like that. I've always seen the same blood androgen level outcome from the same milligrams, but it's worth mentioning that the inter-individuality between those milligrams is ridiculous. I've got a client on 2 milligrams of test a week. I've got another client on 15, believe it or not, to hit the same sort of mid to upper range. So that, you know, blood androgen outcome from X milligram of anabolics is hugely inter-individual. It's also hugely inter-individual what happens when the androgen gets to the androgen receptor. Like what kind of gene transcription to turn on anabolic machinery we see there is so wildly different between individuals that it's unbelievable, as is the potential for virilization from a specific dose and things like that. So paying attention to individuality is another important input here, rather than, you know, this person says I'm going to use X milligrams and that's all I can ever do. So it's best like starting with the lowest dose possible, see what happens. And if it does absolutely nothing, then you're likely more sensitive or insensitive than this individual, and cautiously creep things accordingly.
Got it.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I think with that as well, it's the hyper individuality of it all as well, isn't it? I think blanket dosing and blanket prescribing, I would like to think we'd pulled away from that. Perhaps not. In your experience, do you find people coming to you with cookie cutter designs and protocols? Does that even still happen anymore?
Oh yeah, of course it does. 10 milligram anavar for 12 weeks. It done. You know,
that's nothing.
What happened to 5?
That's just everyone's prep, isn't it? There's plenty of coaches just whipping that bad boy out. And it works. Of course, there's 70 milligrams of androgens, works quite well. And most women will be able to get away with that once, maybe twice, maybe 3 times. I always use the analogy of filling up a cup. I see a lot of people have stolen it. Brad Wymark, if you're listening to this, I see you stole my thing the other day as well and filmed it for Physique Collective. I'm going to steal my own analogy.
Well, I've definitely heard Holly say the cup scenario, and it's definitely something that I've even used. I think you need to place like a trademark on all of your things.
I can't. I'm not going to go on like another big a PED.
Yeah, we won't name him.
Social media name.
Run.
I own everything.
But you definitely made up the cup, so we can roll with the cup. That is definitely yours.
I've not made that up, to be honest. That might have been something that I heard somewhere. I mean, according to this individual, everything that's ever come out of my mouth has been stolen.
Claim it.
Yeah, fuck it, I'll have it. But anyway, so, you know, virilization wise, there is going to come a point of exposure, both duration and magnitude of exposure, that you are hit with that, and there's kind of nowhere to go unless you just want to go balls out female bodybuilder. Balls out is the right
quite literally.
Excuse the pun.
But
yes, that does. Widely.
I suppose to our listeners, maybe if they're, because we have a lot of first timers or people that maybe are like listening to this and they're hearing the words like, what the hell are they talking about? Like, why would somebody opt for, you know, using, if their coach threw it at them, opting for something like Primo over using something like oral anavar? Why might that be better for them, quote unquote? Yeah, a consideration.
Yeah, so when it comes to androgens, females should generally lean towards the most divorced from androgenicity, i.e., the ones that are going to carry per milligram the lowest net amount of male characteristic driving capabilities. And we have a kind of hierarchy here. Primobolan is most definitely the most tissue selective and divorced from androgenicity molecule that we have available to us right now that's been approved for human use. And we've got decades of studies to reference. I think non-steroidal SARMs are going to be the big thing in the future. We're not quite there yet. And then behind Primobolan, Mastron, again, in comparison studies, has been divorced from androgenicity very well as compared to nandrolone or as compared to testosterone. And then I put third down the list something like Anavar. So the trade-off of using Mastron or Primobolan would be the injection route of administration. However, injection technology is so sublime now that you can use a 30 gauge insulin pen that is so small, if you turn the other way, you would never feel it. And you can inject subcutaneously, which is painless, microdosing these tiny volumes of oil. It's so easy. And you avoid the hepatic toxicity, the liver toxicity that comes with oral anabolic androgenic steroid use, which is going to be associated with something like Anavar. Now, I will say, if you're talking about 1 or 2 cycles of anabolics, it's not going to make a great deal of difference which of these molecules you choose between, assuming Primo, Mastron, Anavar. But it's always 1 cycle or 2 cycle, and then before you know it, you've been competing for a decade. So I would still tread cautiously, and why not pick the best option available to you? So Primo is always my go-to with clients that can source it reliably, or Mastron if not.
Yeah. And just on that one, it's somebody who's in a position where like Australia, they don't have access. What would be your kind of preferred approach when it comes to the assistance side of thing?
Australian clients is normally Mastron is fairly easily accessible there. It seems to be easier than Anavar, and it seems to be much easier than Primo.
Okay.
But if you don't have a source that you really reliably trust, you could be getting some testosterone or some Dianabol. Just don't.
Yeah. It's a
Avoid.
tough one if you're it's a tough one if that's what people are considering, because of where you're at, depending, like we said, the score where you're at in the world, like it depends so much, who you're getting it off. As well. And even if you were going on Anavar, you don't always know, even in the States as well, like that's a big one. So yeah, it's just, I suppose it's the risk you run, isn't it?
We're very lucky in the UK to have the ability of sourcing that we do.
And the educators as well. Like I feel like we're just so much more far ahead. I think we've said it before on podcasts, but there's probably still a bit to go with coaches, but we're definitely doing a lot more than most places in the world. But yeah, it's interesting. And I suppose, is there anything, like, obviously I touched on it in peak week, but is there any route you absolutely wouldn't go down when it comes to a female athlete in the assistance side of things? Any compounds that you wouldn't use? Or I suppose
there's androgens that I wouldn't use. Anything highly androgenic. Like Halo, Winstrol, I would massively prefer not to. Dianabol, most definitely not. Boldenone, most definitely not. Nandrolone, most definitely not. I seen it, and there was a craze at one point with women using nandrolone phenylpropionate (NPP), which was always a myth to me why women went that way. So it's a potent steroidal progestin, which we know are the most neurotoxic of all anabolic androgenic steroids, especially in a position where you would have no estrogen action. Both estradiol and growth hormone appear to be neuroprotective in the presence of androgens. So you never want to be, in absence of those, using like high doses of NPP. Cognitively, people have been left in a poor position whilst using NPP. So I wouldn't go down. I mean, it's quite simple for bikini athletes, like HRT testosterone, and never escalate over testosterone. And if you're very good and competing on a high level, then Primobolan alongside, maybe for the final part of your off season when things are a bit sticky, and then maybe for the final part of your preps. That's twice a year for 4 to 6 weeks, and that's it.
Yeah. And is there anything from a fat loss standpoint that you would stay clear off with a bikini athlete? Like anything that's just too much, or anything that you've heard is too high risk?
As with all of these drugs, the dose is in the poison. The poison is in the dose. I wouldn't, not any of the drugs that we commonly use today would I say, no, definitely don't do that. Clenbuterol, your Himbine, T3, T4, injectable L-carnitine, growth hormone, these can all be used like relatively responsibly by a female. And I'd say even something like DMP, dinitrophenol, like killer fat loss drug and whatnot. But again, the doses in the poison, if you were using like 50 milligram of this, which would crank your resting energy expenditure like 5%, is incredibly safe. This is not a recommendation, by the way. It's an example. Then I wouldn't have an issue with that. One recommendation that I would make, however, when it comes to all of these drugs, is my preference with any athlete would be to kind of not crank any one single metabolic pathway really heavily. This is something that I think I first learned from Austin Stout, and then Dr. Scott Howells, Professor Scott Howells, sorry, somebody that I saw writing about this quite a bit. So rather than using 80 micrograms of clenbuterol, maybe a good idea would be to use 40 micrograms of clenbuterol and 10 milligram of your Himbine to create permissive and synergistic relationships between the two that might even potentiate your fat loss outcomes. You've got something driving free fatty acid oxidation and mobilization. So this kind of both sides of the beta oxidation process covered, rather than cranking one harder, would always be my preference. And actually, here's a shameless plug that I completely forgot about. We're selling the contest prep seminar footage and files, would you say, PowerPoints on the Physique Collective site soon. And my presentation was all on about programming and periodizing a successful competition prep from a PED perspective. And you will never need anything else when you can get these files, because it's a guide. It wasn't a presentation. It was like one of those, if you need this, use this, and here's the starting dose, and here's how you might accumulate based on these things. And that kind of paints that example where I say, like, what are the goals of a contest prep? How do drugs facilitate these goals? You've got anabolism, anti-catabolism, lipolysis, anti-lipogenesis, blah, 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 increasing resting energy expenditure, so on and so forth. Every drug that contributes towards that outcome. What do you need in this moment? Do a needs analysis, use this, so on and so forth. So I'd much rather somebody took that approach rather than just kind of avoid this drug because of this or something,
Yeah. Totally get that.
It's a roadmap. Literally a roadmap. But going back quickly just to sort of T3, T4 around sort of fat loss and things like that. I know there's and I've always sort of been hypersensitive to the thought of especially T3 introduction around sort of thyroid regulation and things like that. Is there any sort of evidence or anything like that that would suggest that the prolonged sort of exposure of T3 or T4 therapies can downregulate thyroid? How quickly does it come back? Is there anything that you can give listeners information around sort of specifically the thyroid?
No, there's the opposite of that. And I did a video on this recently on Physique Collective. There was a paper where there were 3 groups of individuals. One of them were sort of euthyroidal, had normal functioning thyroids that were using exogenous thyroid medications like T4 and T3. And there were some other individuals in there that were not normative, but they're not important to us. So we take the normal individuals that take exogenous thyroid, they have thyroidal axis shutdown, TSH drops, and you then have the exogenous amount of T4, and then how much of that T4 is going through deiodination into T3, and then on top of that, how much T3 you're putting in or whatever. And this study found that after give or take 2 weeks ceasing use of the drug, after long durations of use, normal thyroidal axis function was absolutely recovered, unlike the HPG/HPO axes with the use of exogenous sex steroid hormones. So I wouldn't fear the use of T3 and T4 for any kind of long-term thyroid damage. No.
Brilliant.
Would you say that stress has a bigger impact on the HPTO axis more than the thyroidal one does in terms of getting it back post show?
Yeah, I think thyroidal axis recovery is likely just going to be primarily driven by sufficient caloric intake.
Okay.
Yeah. No reverse dieting.
No.
Yeah.
HPO axis is a little bit more complicated as such in terms of kind of multiple inputs that are going to be responsible when it comes to body fat regulation and appetite signaling and things like that. It's a much more longer duration consideration.
Yeah, absolutely. Amazing.
Yeah.
My amazing I could honestly ask you so many questions.
Chew your brain.
This is the thing, we'd hear for ages. I think that says a lot, because you're definitely somebody in the industry who I look up to a lot. And obviously I've with Ross, and Ross has looked up to you, so like you are like the person in the industry I think to go to for everything. So for the listeners, if they want to get in touch, I know you're taking on a small handful of clients. I presume you might be still doing consults for maybe coaches or blood work or anything like that.
I do the odd consult now and then. So the people that I coach now, and if you want coaching, get in touch if you are an IFBB NPC competitor, and that's it. To get in touch with me or any of my team, it is physiquecollective.com. We also have the Physique Collective app, which is the big primary part of our business, where we have literally hundreds of hours of content, something like 300 hours of content there, all professionally filmed. All literally, our moniker there is Physique Development Simplified. So all of the topics covered are not in scientific jargon. They're broken down very simply to understand. If you don't understand anything, we have the forum for open discussion on there. There's a thread called Ask Joe Anything, where people can come and ask me any questions they want at any time. We've just hit 2,000 replies on that last week. So if you ever want to spend a long day reading stuff, have a look at that thread. There's a hell of a lot on there. And I'm really proud.
I don't think you probably haven't missed anything. To know anything that people want to know, it's probably there. And even if you have the question, I'm sure, Joe, you will go and you'll find the answer if you don't know.
Every drug used in bodybuilding has been covered extensively at Physique Collective right now, in every scenario for male and females. You can dig through people's prep logs on there, see how they're doing things from drug wise, nutrition wise, peaking wise. There's just so much on there, and it's only $9.99 a month, So
even if it's just for the athletes' awareness for themselves, and the ability for them to ask the questions that we keep saying on this podcast. We want you to be able to ask your coach these questions, and have them dig for the answers too. So no, you're doing great things, Joe, and we really appreciate you coming on to chat. But yeah, thanks a million. Thanks for listening, guys.